My name is Eric Ferrari. The Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans, PAAIA, has asked me to do an educational video series on Iran sanctions and how they impact the Iranian American community. While this video series will provide answers on many common questions regarding Iranian sanctions and how they impact the Iranian American community, nothing in this video series should be construed as legal advice. If you have specific questions regarding how Iran sanctions may impact you, you should contact a licensed legal professional who has experience in dealing with the Office of Foreign Assets Control and is knowledgeable about U.S. economic sanctions targeting Iran. Somehow, some way, a myth has been perpetrated through the Iranian American community. Namely, that any transfer from Iran to the United States of money requires an OFAC license. This is simply not true. What OFAC and the Iranian transactions and sanctions regulations are concerned with are prohibited categories of activity. Those prohibited categories include importation of Iranian origin goods or services, exportation or re-exportation of U.S. origin goods, services, or technology to Iran, transactions for Iranian origin goods or services, prohibited investment, evasion of U.S. sanctions, or prohibited facilitation. If your transfer of money does not relate to any one of those prohibited categories of activity, you likely do not need an OFAC license to carry out the transaction. In order to determine whether or not your transaction requires an OFAC license, consider the underlying activity related to that funds transfer. Are you engaged in the sale of a property? Are you engaged in a business transaction? Or are you just receiving a gift from Iran? If the activity itself falls into one of the prohibited categories that I mentioned earlier, such as importing goods or services, dealing in Iranian origin goods or services, or exporting goods, services, or technologies, then your funds transfer, as well as the underlying activity, would require an OFAC license. However, if the activity itself, for example, receiving a gift from Iran, did not implicate one of those prohibited categories of activity, no OFAC license would be needed. Remember, an OFAC license is not for the funds transfer itself, but rather to engage in the activities underlying that funds transfer. No license is required here. The reason being is that no category of prohibited activity has been implicated by the transfer from the party in Iran to the United States, so long as that funds transfer takes place through a third country financial institution. Specifically, there's a regulation at 31 CFR 560.550, which states that non-commercial personal remittances from Iran to the United States or from the United States to Iran are generally authorized. In this scenario, the permanent legal resident certainly requires an OFAC license. One, he's a U.S. permanent legal resident, means he's a U.S. person. Even though he's in Germany, that characterization carries with him to the third country. Since he's transferring funds to Iran for the purpose of starting a construction business, he's engaging in a prohibited investment. Therefore, that investment will remain prohibited unless OFAC issues a specific license. She certainly requires a license in this scenario. But the license is not necessarily just for the transfer of the funds from Iran to the United States, but for actually selling the stock. Once she receives a license authorization to sell that stock, the transfer of funds from Iran to the U.S. becomes ordinary and necessary to consummate the transaction. As such, it's contemplated by the OFAC license authorization. The factual scenarios can go on forever. The important thing to note here is that there's a U.S. nexus in all of these transactions. Either there's a U.S. citizen or permanent legal resident involved, U.S. goods or services are involved, or you have a U.S. company involved. If you have the U.S. nexus and you have a transaction with a sanctioned jurisdiction such as Iran, there's a high likelihood that that transaction is prohibited and can constitute an OFAC violation. Again, everything that we've said in this video today is informative in nature and should not be construed as legal advice. If you have specific questions, contact a licensed legal professional with experience in dealing with OFAC and who's knowledgeable about the OFAC regulations. Thank you.